Welcome, everybody, to our 9th Scholars in the Square lecture of the fall season. Hello to those of you who are in the room, of course, and those of you who are joining us through Zoom and in the future through YouTube. After Dr. Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly offers a 20-minute public presentation, perhaps 22 minutes, he says, he will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with an interlocutor familiar with the issues that he's going to be teasing out. In this case, the interlocutor is Rabbi Harry Brechner, the rabbi of the local conservative egalitarian synagogue, Congregation Emmanuel. After Emmanuel and Harry talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period with everybody in the room, but also folks on Zoom. Our speaker today is Dr. Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, professor in our School of Public Administration here at UVic. He's also the Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Policy and Governance, and many people at UVic and beyond will know him as the driving force behind the Borders and Globalization, or the BIG project. His interest in the implications and meanings of borders between nations, societies, and communities led him to an interest in the ways Jewish communities create and sustain borders between public and private, and religious and secular activities. He enriches our conversations at the center with his insights into Judaism, European identity debates, and the larger social and political forces shaping our increasingly imperiled world. And speaking of the ways people communicate during these difficult times, and of the ways people try to live better lives than their ancestors have lived, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now, please join me in welcoming Emmanuel.
It's a real honor, and it's really wonderful to spend 6 months at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. I have been in research centers across the world in different places, and I think this is my best experience in 30 years as a professor. And this is a small praise to the staff and directors and the board members. It's been absolutely enlightening, and really, I've learned lesson almost every time I went to have coffee at 11 a.m. The reason I had applied originally was a very simple reason, and I just wanted to see what rabbis do when they talk about borders. I had no knowledge of anything, basically, and so I start from very far. Some people study the Talmud for a life, and they think they know nothing about their life, so bear with me while I go through this. What I'm really interested in is comparing what social scientists have debated for about 100 years that I know of the history of ideas in border studies, and I have published quite a bit across a vast array of topics, and basically rabbis' discussions in the Talmud and obviously looking at the Torah, but halakhic discussions as well. And today, rather than discuss actually two of the key ideas that have come anyway to me, the idea of the limit, the gvul, or the idea of the eruv, which is the Sabbath border. I've only discussed the Sabbath border. I've organized my talk in 5 different areas. One is a short history of borders, where I basically try to characterize what international boundaries are and what they do. And then I jump into the topic of Sabbath and Eruvin. Eruv in your backyard is the 3rd part. And then I look at what I call the Levite city, the ideal Eruv, and then conclusions and notes. And you'll see at the end that I think I've learned some things that I had no idea would discover. So when we look at borders, we have different words. In English, especially, you have boundaries, borders, borderland, border region. You have limes, you have frontier. And they express different aspects of what borders are. The boundary is a line. And for a long time, that line was an illusion because we never had the maps that we needed to actually understand it. This is kind of the counterexample, the Hadrian wall, which is built on a ridge, right? But and it's well known, but it's counterintuitive. Actually, most maps were very imprecise. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit. Borders were really like frontiers. They were porous, and they were, and authorities were trying to control them, like the Romans, for instance, with their garrisons that sometimes up to 24,000 people would be posted outside of the empire to maintain and try to control population movements and some trade. But when we look at the idea of boundary lines, for instance, or diet, which is actually the legal term, today what we discover is that it's not possible for a human to draw a diet until the mid-1800s. We do not have the technology. We have sometimes lines that are quite linear on maps, but these are exceptions. And I want to illustrate this by this map. The map here, actually, I thought that would be better seen than that. It's the region around Avignon where the popes had actually an enclave inside inside France from, about the 1300 all the way to Napoleon Bonaparte. And what is really interesting is all of the historians that I've studied this is that they describe the boundary line of the Comté Venetia, where, by the way, Jews had specific legal protection and status there in 4 of the cities, and they still existing synagogues there that are active. The boundaries or the border is described like a lace with holes inside it, right? So, for instance, in Beaulieu, which is just, if you follow the darker line that is at the bottom of the map, you've got a little enclave right there called Beaulieu. And Beaulieu is outside of the Comté, yet it was part of it. That expresses this idea that borders are entangled, they're made of enclave, exclave, they are so undetermined that they are considered to be incoherent at that time. And then obviously things become a bit more complex. You have Hugo Grotius, who thinks that legally we should kind of muscle up and develop new ideas. He comes up with the idea of sovereignty and the idea that foes can become friends in times of peace. It is a critical time in the history of the modern state because basically powers start recognizing sovereignty, which is the exercise of violence, the recognition that partners can exercise violence on their own territories, right? So it's the idea that you can exercise violence within your own territory and that you will not interfere with the exercise of violence outside of the territory. And so then the boundary line or the border becomes much more important. About 2 centuries later, actually 1.5 centuries later, you have John Harrison, who invents the clock that I put here, which allows us with the sextant together to identify dots on maps. And so suddenly we have the ability to create unilinear lines and boundary lines, both at sea and on territory. This, however, doesn't actually come in a way in the legal environment until the Treaty of Vienna and then the Treaty of Paris, 1919. So you see that this idea that we have maps that are very precise is something that is fairly recent and I would say just over 100 years. But you also get a sense that the era of control started with Hugo Grotius, and the era of control is about controlling the mobility of population across powers, which is what international boundaries do to this day. Today, what we have, because of the information communication revolution, is a completely transformation of this, and thanks to your phones, actually, intelligence agencies know where you are at any time. They can follow you. They know what you do if they want. They can spy on you. They can do this across very vast areas of land and across many different people. We are in the era of surveillance, Foucault, and obviously Deleuze discussed this before we became aware of this. What I'm pointing to here is that international boundaries are really, in a way, objects that control territories, but also individuals. And that they are very oppressive. In some regions of the world, they kill thousands of people every single year. Now, when we look at, the Eruv, the Shabbat border, it's actually quite outstanding because you can read both the Torah and the Talmud and you discover another universe, a completely different universe, where the idea of the Sabbath is basically governed to be holy, right? So that day is a day of rest and no creative endeavors. That's the best way I think that I can have to discuss it. should actually be undertaken by anyone who is willing to follow the commandments, right? So observant Jews limit their movements. They know that they cannot move. And it's counterintuitive, but some of the rules that I've read in the Talmud talk about 4 cubits. You basically are supposed to stay within a very small space, unless you're inside your private space. It's quite interesting to look at this. What I found really interesting is that rabbis discuss 4 different kinds of space: the private domain, the public domain, and the intermediate domain called also Karmelit. Private domain can be your house, your apartment. The public domain can be a street, and it has a certain size, and it is described, and bear with me here, I want to go in the details. It is described very specifically in terms of its width and in terms of people that are using the space and so on and so forth. The Karmelit is a space in between that sometimes is undefined, but it's also a little bit smaller than the public space. So if you think about living in a building, you have an apartment, that's your private domain. The staircase and the small courtyard at the bottom of the staircase might be Karmelit. But if it's really big, if it's like built in a certain way, it could almost become a public space. But certainly outside of your apartment, the street is a public space. The counterintuitive thing to discover is that Eruv is about bringing those spaces together during Sabbath. So the question I have is, why would rabbis want to do this? What is the purpose of the Eruv? And the work that I want to take you through is to look at the construction of an Eruv in your own backyard. So you see a house, you see a shed, in that case it's a sukkah, but it's a shed, and you see 4 pillars and 2 strings in between. That is basically an Eruv. You can walk from the house into the shed on Sabbath. You can carry, you can take your child, you can take your keys, and so on and so forth, right? But then it becomes really interesting is that in this case, I had used a note from the Silver Spring Eruv Association on a day that their neighborhood Shabbat Eruv had been breached. And so they said, they sent to everybody this through their phone, and they said, if you want to build your own Eruv, here's how you should proceed. What you discover here is that, in a way, mimicking what you find in the Talmud, and I'll come to the Talmud in a minute, you discover that there are many different options that have already been thought through. That you can use fence, you can use pre-existing building, you can use pre-existing fence, poles, and so on and so forth. You are basically building your Eruv with what is in your natural environment already right there at you. And then you can complement it so that it actually becomes a proper Eruv. There are ways to do this that are right, and there are ways to do this that are so-called posum, that are not okay. And so you have a lot of detailed rules. And I would say there is a minutiae, there is a great effort in describing all of the different possible options that are acceptable and the ones that are less acceptable. And here you have 4 cases where you see that it's not acceptable. Now I go in the Talmud and I cite some of the Eruv in 2b3 and so on and so forth. You can see a list of a number of ways that are being discussed, and you realize that all of these options are discussed in dozens and dozens of options in very practical manner. And the question that I had when I was reading these 4 weeks is, why is it that the rabbis are so interested in the precision? Why do we have to go into so many details? What is at stake in the description of you? I understand, like all of us, that it's private domain plus public domain, and we're trying to create a space that brings these 2 together, maybe in harmony. There is obviously the whole and fundamental issue of the Holy Sabbath, which is also there, but the minutiae that we're dealing with is quite extraordinary. Just to illustrate this, here you have alleyways that are, that you have alleyways, and how do you basically bring these different dwellings together? So one of the things that I discover as I read this is that the Levite, which is the old map here, have cities of different shapes, but the Eruv is always square. I find this fascinating. I'm going to elaborate on this. But also what I discovered is that today you have Eruv that are extremely vast, that are basically built on, electric poles or telephone poles, and you have the Eruv wire, you've got the lechi, which is the pole that goes straight into the ground, you've got a cap in between, and you've got the C-staple to hold them. And they can be found in different locations, they exist across the world. And we have in Canada an Eruv, for instance, in Vancouver, we've got 3 in Toronto, and they involve hundreds of individuals, thousands of individuals, neighborhoods, agreements, and so on and so forth. It's outstanding to see how many, kind of work. And then we have the great case of the New York Eruv that was really controversial, where Rabbi Moshe Feinstein basically opposed it for the reason that I list here, concerned about public property use, concerned about, confusion regarding Shabbat, and also concerned about the integrity of the Eruv itself, because obviously the Eruv is quite fragile, and so the Shabbat borders, if you want, the Shabbat Eruv, are really very difficult to maintain. So I have, in a way, found a key here that I find really interesting. The first part is that to create an Eruv, you need a legal agreement between all the members that are involved in the Eruv. And it's symbolically, in a way, organized through the common possession of food. Very often people use a piece of matzo, and I put the galette de la bienfaisance. They come from France because I was raised on those, and I really like those. They make this wine and orange. It's absolutely delicious. You can't find them here. But the idea here is that you have a social production of space, right? You have basically a social production of space, which originally was about, Jewish communities together, but today is much more complex because we're talking about production of space that include many communities across very large and complex urban spaces. You also have the issue of observance, right? It's self-imposed. There is no higher authority in this case. People who are observing the Shabbat and people who are observing the Eruv are not told you have to. They work through it. They basically decide that they will self-impose. And so this is that there is no higher authority, but it involved negotiating with higher authority, for instance, building management and municipalities. So when we look at the perfect city, and that's the example of the Levite, it's my second example, and I only have 3 slides on that one, and I conclude. What we have here is discovering that in the case of the perfect city, the rabbis are discussing the shape of the city before anything else. The city is long, the city is square, the city is round, the city is triangular, the city has protruding houses on here, there are turrets that are coming too high, and so on and so forth. And you have the examples here out of my Talmud Eruvin book, which I find fascinating. Every single time it has to be square. And then every single time, in a way, the Eruv expands by 2,000 cubits, which today would translate into almost a kilometer. It's about 950 meters or 3/4 of a mile. And so what I have here, which I find really interesting in the case of the Levite ideal city, is that you have almost an arithmetic way of thinking about the space. So we have 2 options. You have the option where one person creates their own Eruv and then talks to their neighbor, and then to the neighborhood, and then multiple neighborhoods, and then you create entire spaces like in Vancouver, Toronto. You have Eruvs that basically negotiate the space that they have, or you have the ideal city. And these 2, for me, are 2 different examples. They're 2 different ways of thinking about the Eruv, but they tell us something about what the rabbis had in mind. So here is what I think. I think the Eruv city, in the ideal case, designs a Sabbath map. And I agree with David Kramer, who writes in Rabbinic Judaism, Sabbath is a space day, a day of location and dwelling. It is your place for this time. Sit there, dwell there, celebrate there in a space that is in time. And the context And the analysis that Kramer brings to us is the context of, the destruction of the Second Temple. So we're talking about 70 CE, the 9th of Av, B'Av, and the idea that the rabbis map in minute details the holy space of a displaced people. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because the temple has been destroyed, and yet how do you reproduce the space of the temple, bring people together across a certain space that is holy and expands the energy of the positive energy, the holiness of the Sabbath. So the imaginary Sabbath map cannot ever be taken away. It is a map of freedom, and in my mind, not just freedom, self-imposed freedom if you want. It is constrained, it is built, it is very sophisticated, but also of equality, because space in the Levite city is arithmetically defined. It doesn't discuss how many people live in the city. Everybody shares the same space, and you have it here. It's a complex space with open areas and so on and so forth. I'm concluding with this slide. So what I discovered, which I think is, it's going to keep me busy for many, many years. It's going to be like my new passion, and I don't know if I'll find grants to work on this, but certainly I'm going to be working on this for at least 10, maybe more years, is that rabbis draw in extreme minute detail halakha, eventually, right? It's discussed in the Talmud, but eventually halakha that keep Shabbat holy, and they proceed in certain ways. Their primary concern is reminding the observant of the Shabbat holiness. So the Eruv is not a substitute. The Eruv is actually one of ways to expand the Shabbat, to bring the community together. That is why it's made of everything you want, including strings. It doesn't have to have walls. It's not like an international boundary, right? And it points to a number of things that I find fascinating: the self-organizing capacity of communities, but also the obligation to engage with diverse communities to create the Eruv. The Eruv in halakha shapes the conduct of people. In other words, people, there is no absolute power. So what we see is that laws determine people's freedom. It's self-imposed. I took some citations out of this, but there is some writing around the democracy principles. Anyway. So what I discovered, which I think is quite remarkable in the last 4 months, and I'm very grateful to Rabbi Harry for this, because he supported my application. I'm also grateful for Shama, who's over there, and who I know was on the board, and didn't say, no, I'm not going to have that guy work on these things, is that we can talk about boundaries in completely different ways. Borders can be conceptualized, and I had never thought about it before, right? And I discovered Eruv means to join together. It's to work together. It's to be together. And Rabbi Harry, the other day when we were discussing this, said to me, oh no, Eruv, Emmanuel, it's about blending. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Save time. Oh, thanks for inviting me, Emmanuel. So I think the piece that, if I were sitting and didn't know the knowledge I know, is what's the deal? Like, why don't we carry on Shabbat? Like, I imagine all of you are asking the same question, like, what's wrong with carrying? And what are the whole sense of Shabbat prohibitions, right? So they're called malacha, which is often meaning work, but it's not work, right? Because work is what? Force times distance as far as physics. So I could take a dumbbell in my basement and run it up to my bedroom and back down to my basement all day long on Shabbat, and I'm not breaking Shabbat rules. So what is the sense of these? We have 39 major categories of activities that we don't do on Shabbat. And before I even explain what that is, because I think it's important, and we can jump into a discussion, is that, this is coming from the Rabbinic tradition. So the Rabbinic tradition being, ending at like the 6th century. and everything else about that is commentary and trying to understand how we implement it. But the rabbis themselves say that all of these 39 laws and all of the laws that extend to Shabbat prohibitions, they call it a mountain that hangs by a hair. Because mostly things in Jewish law need to have a peg somewhere in Torah, in the narrow sense of Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, or somewhere from the Hebrew Bible. And it has a minor peg, which you pointed out from Genesis, in a sense, but there is a lot of kind of construct that we're dealing with, which I think is partially why we get so many details. But one of the ideas of why the 39 types of work that we don't do, all of them were kind of associated with the operation and building of the temple, as well as the Mishkan, which would have been a human idea of, if we have this space, that it will be a dwelling place for the divine to be amongst us. And so, for instance, I can't weave on Shabbat because weaving would have been, having woven things would have been something in the temple. I can't sow seeds because there would have been the showbread in the temple. The fascinating thing is that when the temple stood, these activities were permitted only in the realm of the temple. And the temple is also seen as a microcosm of the universe. So in terms of carrying, it's kind of a fascinating thing. The idea that I would want to have to bring things to the temple, whether it would have been sacrificial animals or grains or whatever it was, and that I don't do that on Shabbat. I just thought it was important to kind of get that idea together, which is why I think what gives it some depth. But also, I think that I wanted to just talk a little bit about the eruv, the idea of the word itself, right? So right now it's evening. Evening in Hebrew is erev or mariv, because it's the time of blending. It's where the day blends into the night. The direction west in Hebrew is marav, also seen as the place of blending. I always find kind of fascinating living in the West, because I think we do tend to, come pretty close to appropriation, from cultural appropriation in the West, because we're so busy blending cultures and who we are and what we do in the West. But my question to you is, when we talk about private and public domain, what do you think about the commons? Because I think that by adding the food and then everyone having a level of ownership, it becomes the commons, which I think is an idea that we're losing in today's world. Everything's been privatized, right? Even BC ferries, right? We used to own it once upon a time. That sense of like, what do we as the people get to own? And not just the people, but as a species, as humans. And to me, that kind of speaks back to that.
Yes, and I agree. I think it's really a good question. Thank you so much. I thought about it when I read in greater detail Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's view on the Manhattan. It's such a large space. I don't know if any of you have walked Manhattan, but I have walked Manhattan many, many years ago to look for a job. I was located in Wall Street, actually not exactly, just above Wall Street at the YMCA, and I went all the way to past Columbia to look for a job. I had taken, anyways, it takes you a whole day. So what's your sense of community? So, the common, and this is what I was thinking, a piece of metal. I mean, the metal that I showed you on the map, they're about this size. They're made with orange and wine, I said, right? But what is the sense of community and building the commons in a space where you have such large population? They were, I think, Antiope was one of the largest city at the time, right? 600,000 people. But today I'm wondering, how do you build a common? And is that not a reason not to have actually such large eruv? Because you lose the sense of community, and you kind of also, in a way, don't understand what the foundations of the common idea, right? Because the idea of sharing food is to create a family, is to share a meal, is to be together. And I don't see this happening when you have such large spaces that are organized. Contractually, it works, but you lose sense of the community building. And so when he opposed it, especially because he said potential confusion regarding Shabbat observance. I was thinking, is that not making space to sense to a certain extent? You lose sense of community, you lose sense of the commons. And in our society, it's a huge issue because we privatize everything. Mm-hmm. So you create a common by sharing a piece of food, which is fundamental, I think, to Shabbat because of the benediction. I mean, when you think about the Shabbat table, for instance, how many benedictions we have? You have benedictions for your children, for your wife. You've got singing for the angels. You've got benediction for the bread, for the wine, for the food. And then suddenly all of this kind of evaporates. That's kind of my idea, that this idea of the commons is fragile. And it's at risk today.
It is, but it allows for like a huge move like this, allows for different communities to connect, right? So when you come to the new world, you may live in one neighborhood and have family in another neighborhood, right? And I think the food it's part of the legal fiction, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, legal fictions are important in Judaism, right? Yeah. I think it shows a sense of love of the law, that I'm going to find a way to like get around it as best I can and be as erudite as I can to sort of get to my needs within the law. Yeah. But I think that sense of the food is just there for it's symbolic.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's symbolic, but again, I think if you can be disconnected from it if the eruv is so large. It brings communities together. And when I look at, for instance, the example, this is kind of why I put the Toronto example there. The Toronto example is obviously on the right-hand side. And one thing that you see, if you see the line where the green and the red are meeting, you've got actually ways to go from one eruv into the other eruv. But it doesn't happen between the blue and the red. And I was thinking, wow, that's really interesting. I would want to go and inquire more in detail what has happened.
That's the eruv I would never go into.
Those people are crazy. Right.
And then there are other issues, and a lot of people who study planning or urban design and who are interested in this and do, for instance, people who are, and I've read, I don't know, 4 or 5 dozen articles on this. They're really interested in this competing eruv. And then I was reading recently a study where you have basically large developments where you've got thousands and thousands of families who live there. And then the rabbis don't agree on how kosher is a certain eruv because of certain design flaws. And then the communities will kind of disassemble. They will not respect certain eruv even though their dwelling is inside a certain eruv. So they consider that they're outside. And so we're recreating these differences. So this is kind of why I was thinking, in the case of New York, the idea of the symbolic food as the contractual link to the community can be fragile. And this, I wondered if that was not why an Orthodox rabbi was really against it.
I hate to say it, but I think that, I think rabbis in that world tend to be about authority, right? The more authority I have, the more power I have, and the more stringent I am, the more authority I appear to hold. And I think that gets into play as well. Interestingly enough, I believe that the eruv in Los Angeles is even bigger, because it's a huge area. And I don't even know if it's actually a rabbi who was in charge, because I used to know the person who would kind of check in with other people before Shabbat to make sure it was okay. And they had a little symbol, so you knew the eruv was set. And that was kind of how they worked it, because it required a number, because it was so huge, it required people in different parts of Los Angeles to be able to check and call in.
So the eruv in New York, I've read enough about it. You have a few people who take cars and they basically follow the eruv on Wednesdays and Thursdays, mostly Thursdays, to make sure it's absolutely in good shape, so that when the Sabbath hits, that it's there. But sometimes it only takes for road work to happen an hour later, and then nobody knows that that wire matters to us. It just goes. It's really interesting to see this. So the integrity of the Eruv is a big issue because they're actually quite fragile. I love the idea that you use the environment, but also that you complement the environment. You don't build fences. It's not a border to contain. It's a border to know that the border is there. It's a symbolic border. It's beautiful.
But it's a real border in the sense that it allows certain things and disallows other things on the other side, right? So, and I suppose the critique is that if you make a border almost the size of the island of Manhattan, then that's a kind of a bit of a weaselism, right? that all of a sudden all bets are off. You can carry anything within this, well, just Manhattan, right? So then it means that many of these halakhic rules that are supposed to be observed on Shabbat are not really necessary anymore. Right?
At least the one to carry.
Yeah, at least
certainly that one is dismissed.
But the purpose of them is, I mean, this is perhaps what we haven't really quite addressed, is to make things a bit difficult, to make your life a little bit difficult, and to remember certain things.
I don't think it's difficult. I think that it's about the sense of not doing.
Yeah.
Right. I think that we think about difficult that I can't do. Right. And I think that you spoke about it a lot in terms of it being freeing and liberating.
Yeah.
Like for me, for instance, I mean, I could care less, I carry on Shabbat, right? It's not a big deal if I know.
I'm going to sit over
the
here.
lightning's coming. But a sense of knowing, like, when I was a student, knowing that, okay, I've got a paper that's really important that's due, but it's Friday.
Yeah.
I'm moving into Shabbat. I'm going to put it down. It doesn't need to be part of my life, right? I get to escape from, technology for 25 hours. It's just sort of like I can move into a zone where everything is kind of cared for and ready. So it is creating, as you said, also this kind of boundaries in time, right? And it's also taking time and sanctifying that time as something special. So in those moments, I can be, a human being and not a human doing.
That's right.
And I'm not going to answer emails. I'm not going to worry about all of the noise. I'm going to have time to just be still.
Yeah.
Or to do whatever it is that is going to give me some sense of pleasure within this kind of basket of life.
25 hours between Shabbat and Haftarah, which I think is total freedom. You can read, you can't write, but you can read, you can study Torah, you can read the Talmud, you can do whatever. You should take care of your family. I think these are really kind of healthy ideas.
But Harry, the fact that you'll carry on Shabbat, but you wouldn't do other kinds of work. So you wouldn't answer emails, right? So everyone's negotiating what it might mean.
I think that everyone in different traditions cherry picks.
Yeah.
Right? I think that if you don't cherry pick, you're just going to go, you'll go nuts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are people who love the stringencies, right?
Yeah.
It never worked for me. I'm not big into rules and stringencies. I don't know how I became a rabbi. But
right, so this rabbi loves the stringencies and feels like, well, he's being ripped off.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And it's worth asking what it means to be ripped off of stringency. Because most of us don't like stringency, but some people do. Yeah.
Yes, and this is why you have so many Jewish communities that have different understanding of the halakha, basically, and it's always and you follow.
So halakha, by the way, is sort of the body of Jewish law. But the word itself is kind of interesting because it just really means the way or to walk. It's kind of like the Tao of Judaism. But it's also, halakha is not necessarily set, right? It needs to evolve. It's dynamic and it's changing. And it needs to adapt into the world that we live in, which is why you see something like the New York Eruv.
And this is why we have all these discussions and ongoing discussions, but also, the whole idea that you can do exegesis of established rules, basically. And when this is one of the things that I like the most, is that the debate is ongoing, and the arguments and its contraries, and all of the possible options are always on the table. And this is kind of a way of thinking that I find, I don't know, it's like, I wish we were more in that world today than ever, if I may say, right? It's like, why is everything should be black and white? I like the gray. I think, we should pull in all directions. So when I look at Eruv discussions points, this is kind of what I find so inspiring, is that, and I know I'm geeky about borders, but I discovered a new way of thinking about this stuff that I've never seen before. It's fascinating.
Well, and there's two things that happen in Talmud, right? In Talmud, you're studying a minority opinion a good chunk of the time. You're studying an opinion that doesn't work out. And you're following the logic, and you're even going to argue for it to some extent to understand what's going on, and then trying to understand what was this sage in the 3rd century, what was happening in his own socioeconomic world that he's making these kinds of statements and sort of working that through. But then you also take things to the absolute place of absurdity to kind of understand what it is, right? Is it this? Is it that? If I pull it all the way over here, is it still going to work? And I think in Eruvin as a tractate in Talmud is in my memory, right? I studied Eruvin years ago and then kind of said, I don't need to do that again. But I'm glad someone likes it. I have it here. Wasn't my thing, but it's there. But it's also, I think, what really fascinates me is that sense, and I wanted to get your sense of the blending, right? Because borders are hard and fast.
Yes.
Right? And we have this blending, and what does it mean to be in the private domain, in an intermediate domain, and then into the, first of all, Talmud has, in terms of the intermediate domain in courtyards, Talmud has huge things to do with courtyards, because some of it was about living in a courtyard and maintaining peace between families, and between tenants. And how does that work? Because often your garden, which was a main source of sustenance, was in your courtyard as well.
But this is kind of the counterintuitive part, is why do we have and a roof during Shabbat in a way expands the power of Shabbat across a whole community. I find this absolutely fascinating. The idea that you can have your roof in your garden. I've been saying to my family, we don't really need one. We have a fence all around, but I'm still going to build one just for the exercise of it. It is fascinating. The idea that you have one. But then the idea is to bring your neighbors into this. Right? So you are expanding the holiness of Shabbat through the Eruv because you're sharing food. And then you have the tendency, obviously natural, to develop, in a way, a community right, with your neighbors. And it shines especially on Shabbat.
Unless your neighbors happen to be hostile to the idea, in which case then you have a different set of dilemmas to deal with.
But the rabbis like it that you engage with your neighbor and discuss it. This is why, the rules are about sharing food and contractually doing it. And you have to obtain their halachic rights, so that you have to obtain their rights to create their rule. How do you do this when the communities are diverse, including communities that are of very different faiths? You still have to work through this. I find this fascinating.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left for a bigger question with the audience, and Shema gets the first crack.
I know I don't want to turn this into an inner conversation between Jews, but I do feel, the Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's ruling on the Eruv is a really complicated example and part of the reason there is an Eruv in Manhattan is because he said, ignore my ruling. That is, so there's multiple layers of him talking about it. And just to clarify a little bit, because sometimes when we do this work, we kind of miss kind of who is impacted. Part of the reason it's such a big deal is that not having an Eruv in Manhattan for these communities would limit particularly women with children from going out. So not so much about men being able to go to synagogue or study, it's really about women with children not being able to leave the house on Shabbat. So that's why it was a really big controversy, and that's why there was a real kind of push to find a way to make it happen. And even Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said, look, this is how I see it, but all these other rabbis who actually have lesser authority than me in halakha typically follow them, even though this is my ruling. So it's a really interesting example, and I'm offering this because, as you say, you're at the beginning of it. But the other thing I wanted to kind of think about, as you mentioned, like, why do the rabbis spend so much time in the Talmud talking about these details in detail? And one thing that really struck me in your presentation is thinking about the history of borders and kind of sovereignty and violence.
Yes.
And the rabbis are doing this when they have really no authority, even within the Jewish community. Like, we think of them as the rabbis and the Talmud as so authoritative, but when they're doing this, they're not yet in that position.
They don't have the authority that we give them today.
So there's something really interesting in sort of imagining, eruvim and gvulot at a time when you don't have the authority to actually impose it even on your own community in such detail.
Yeah.
And just thinking about kind of borders and violence and power and sovereignty when they don't actually have that sovereignty.
But I don't think rabbis are interested in sovereignty.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's why I think it's a really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, but this is what I find so fascinating, is that we're not discussing sovereignty here. What we're discussing is, in a way, idealistic ideas, right? And creation of communities, bringing people together, which is almost counterintuitive today. Most of our elected officials are, against this. But I really mean it this way. All the discussions and all the controversies, but also all the detail, the way things are being discussed, and in a way, in this, I find this really amazing to read article per article. I'm trained with the French code, right? 1,200 pages when I was in first year law. That's what I read for a year. So I look back at this and I'm thinking, this is the French code invented nothing. These guys were way worse. And then all of the legal discussions and coming in different planes, right? Different levels, coming together and discussing article per article, and every time extremely practical, and eliminating cases, answering impossible questions. I find this just really just completely like illuminating and fascinating.
I'm curious about what you make, and I can't remember the exact nature of these cases, but I'm curious about what you make of the legal cases in Canada, where it seemed like, I like what you said about the obligation. There's an obligation to seek consent from your non-Jewish neighbors, right? But it seems like in these cases in Canada, there's, I don't know, like it is going to the law to make a claim of religious freedom. Like, is that a consensual way of doing that, or is that like a turn towards this sovereign conception?
So one of the ways I think about these issues is that there are different ways to affirm different religions, right? A few years ago, I was in England and I was in Durham, and in Durham, the bells ring every single hour, and I had never experienced anything like this. What I had experienced in the past is living in Morocco, for instance, and having, for instance, people come and sing on, anyway, the expression that Muslim people have, how is it called?
The call for prayer.
The call for prayer,
Yep.
exactly. Which sometimes is in the middle of the night and so on and so forth. And what is different here is that the rabbis tell you have to go and talk to your neighbors. You have to organize, you have to work with the community. In Canada, I know it can be very controversial, but even across Jewish communities, there are articles that I've read that are really interesting about certain diverse Jewish communities in Paris who can't agree on their three or four or more eruv in the same neighborhood because they just cannot get along. But really, when you read the text, they would want you to engage with everybody and find the best possible solution. So I know the modern world has kind of a different take into this, right? Is that even the idea which I thought was well established in the literature, that the self-organizing community idea is a very important one. What I discover is that I have actually colleagues who've started to deconstruct this by saying, well, I have example where this never happens, even among Jewish communities, because the rabbis can't get along with each other. Okay. I don't know if I find those really interesting for now, because I'm more interested about the borders, but certainly from a planning exercise perspective, or from a municipal law exercise perspective, or that might be quite interesting to some people.
But I want to add to that though, because I know that in places like Rockland County, New York, where you've got a fairly good size and powerful Hasidic enclave of like really ultra-Orthodox Jews, there has been complaints by the non-Jewish and as well as liberal Jewish communities not wanting to have an Eruv for fear that with an Eruv, it's going to then attract more of these Hasidic Jews. So it was more about, not in my backyard, or I don't want those kinds of people in my community. And I think that turns into a very different kind of argument, a very different kind of dealing with, but from a theoretical place, I think that sense of, there's a certain expectation that if you approach your neighbor in ways that make sense, and you're not trying to build anything, you're not trying to take down anything, you're not adding anything, you're just sort of creating something from things that really are already existing, right? Like a telephone pole. I think that there was, there's a big difference between theory versus practice in a multicultural kind of space.
But have there been situations in which somebody says, okay, look, I live in Montreal or Brooklyn or something, and there's a lot of telephone poles, there's a lot of stuff in my sky, and you want me to allow you to run another thing through my skyline, which is already muddy with pollution and birds and all sorts of things. So have there been situations in which people have pushed back and said, no, I'm a secular person, this is a secular space, you don't get to do that?
Obviously, you do have these cases.
Yeah. And so I think in some sense that's underlying Neil's question.
That's what I was alluding to, yeah.
Yeah, it's like a tension between secular logics of space and religious logics.
The secular
Mhm.
logic, which is quite strong, for instance, in some areas in France.
Yeah.
So you would have that.
And in Quebec too, places.
Yeah. But again, you still have, every village has a church,
Mhm.
and the bells ring, and and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
I can't really discuss those ideas very well because I'm not fascinated by those. I really like the idea of the boundary and what it means in terms of law and the right to do, or the right, the aspect that is when you cross, you cannot, even buy a fruit, for instance,
Mhm.
which is really what borders do, right? Borders, like the international boundaries that I talked about and the fact that they become invisible are extremely powerful in curtailing our rights, even mobility, right? And today it's kind of interesting to see that, for instance, the way objects move across the world is organized along production lines that are themselves regulated by algorithm and so on and so on. And I work with the World Bank, the World Customs Organization, on, for instance, creating worldwide databases so that they can even use algorithm across those trading lines. So you get a sense that, at one point we'll have computers that will be able to really follow what these things are happening. So conceptually, to study an Eruv and then maybe later Verb, I think is really interesting because it comes from a completely different perspective on what you do with it, which I think is, has a lot of good in it. The idea of building community, the idea of self-disciplining, the idea of you are free within that space. Mm-hmm. We almost have completely forgotten this in so-called democracies we live in.
Question for you. So that sense that, I have this eruv, there's a shared food. Is there a sense of collective ownership? And does collective ownership have a role in creating borders, in creating that kind of space? Because I feel like when I move into the public space in an eruv, I have a certain right. It's mine as well.
That's right. I agree. This is why I talk about the contractual ownership, is that it's also that you create relationship with people, right? But so through the relationship, you both belong, but also have obligation. Mm-hmm. I think this is what is beautiful in the eruv, is that if you go to your neighbor, I keep on thinking about this. Doug, who lives next to me, I'm going to go and say to him, can I create an eruv over your property? Yeah, so I can come on Shabbat and, we can talk, for instance, and I want to see what he's going to have to say about it. But that's the idea, right? It's mutual obligations.
Again?
call was directed to me by Shubham. I
Yeah.
thought, I'm just noticing the constant overlooking of my question over the past
You
week.
need to draw a roof around. it.
Yeah. My room is like this.
So I really like your idea of building a community, but I also noticed Rabbi Harry speaking about difference between practice and theory. So just to give an example of the surveillance and you were speaking, I just want your views on it. So my friend, she's Jewish, a lawyer, a mother, and based in London, and she can't practice Sabbath or interact with her Jewish community because she works several hours a week, has to work on weekends, look after her child. In such circumstances, how do you build a community? How do you go share food, go to the public spaces, observe your faith, or even with diverse communities, like you said, who are tolerant? How do you actually translate your ideal, whatever collectivistic ideas you have, your faith ideas you have, how do you translate them to practice? And also, it's not just about her faith, it's also about her culture because she's an immigrant as well. So, an Israeli immigrant, I'm considering the anti-Semitism in London right now. Like, how do you, how does one translate this beautiful idea into practice?
It's difficult every day, right?
Mhm.
I think that, there's two things, right? So there's the locus of authority in terms of making religious observance decisions. Is that from the rabbi for the collective? I think that in a lot of liberal spaces, it's the individual. Or sometimes it's the community. So in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat, in India, the B'nai Israel community there, and it's not much left of it, but when I was there many years ago, a fairly good-sized community, most of them were civil workers. So they worked on Saturday. Saturday was a work day in Gujarat. And so I remember going Friday night. We had a wonderful Friday night service together. And then I said, I'll be back tomorrow morning. And they said, no, don't come back tomorrow morning. Come back in the late afternoon because we're going to come and gather there. So I think that it always is a kind of blending of sorts in terms of what I can do, what's workable, how do I maintain something that has meaning.
From an individual,
Yeah.
an individual perspective, what you observe is that people actually have to decide you, in a way, your observance is something that you discuss with yourself every day. And I think, if you come from Israel and you end up working, let's say, in London, you probably reinvent your life quite a bit, and also your observance and how, as a Jew, how do you do this? That's a really individual perspective every time.
So tonight the community is commemorating Kristallnacht. So I know we have to let you guys go right away. And so I want to thank you very much for coming by today.
Thank you.